Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see me. I'm Karen de Blasio. I'm a division director in the SNAPS office at HUD. So I'm glad to see so many folks on the phone today. We're going to spend a little bit of time going over kind of where we are with everybody's CARES Act allocation. We should have plenty of time for questions. So again, I want to let you know, please post your questions in the chat. If we aren't able to get to them, please post them in the AAQ afterwards. But hopefully we should have enough time to have some back and forth and be able to have a little bit of discussion through the chat. So again, just to kind of refresh everybody's memory, I don't think anybody has forgotten, but the CARES Act back in 2020, we were appropriated $4 billion through ESG to prevent, prepare, and respond to coronavirus. We all, that greatly expanded everybody's ESG-CV allocation that we're used to getting. We had 361 recipients that included states, localities, and territories that all received these funds. Next slide. So where are we now? First, I will say you guys have all done a great job in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of this, getting, a kind of a very tiny ESG grant to it, quadrupling in some cases. And, again, in the middle of a pandemic and with staffing issues and things like that. So we greatly appreciate all the work that everybody's done over the last 3 years. And so where we are now is we've got about almost 81% of the national allocation. So of that 4 billion, 3.96 billion was allocated directly to communities, and about 81% of that is drawn. 86 million is not committed in IDIS, and I believe most of this is because people are still working out some of the grant agreement issues with reallocations and things like that, but we're working with people individually to try to make sure that money gets reallocated. Draws across the country, we do look at draws on a weekly basis. We're trying to keep up with and keep on top of what everybody's draw rate looks like. And so draws across the country this past week totaled about $13 million. Sorry. We had 65 ESG-CV recipients draw funds in the past week. We've got 54 that have not drawn over the last 90 days. So just a reminder that ESG-CV, or your CARES Act allocation, is implemented through ESG, and there is a requirement that you draw quarterly, and that's pretty much with most of the block grants, I believe. So you have to draw quarterly. So, we want to make sure that you're at least doing a quarterly draw. You can draw weekly if you want it, or monthly. But, we are going to be doing some outreach, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, around folks who we have not seen draw, particularly because we're coming up on that September 30th deadline. Another thing that we've done a lot of outreach over the past several weeks, and we're continuing to do so, is on quarterly reports, or QPRs. So 36 recipients are behind on their quarterly reports. So if you have not heard from your CARES Act desk officer here in SNAPS, you will be hearing from them probably very, very soon about your reporting if you're not up to date on your QPRs. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this slide is really just to give you guys an idea of where the money's been spent. And this is based on draws, what we see in IDIS. So as you can see, a large part, almost 40%, has been drawn down to pay for shelter, which is great. We've got money going towards street outreach, almost 21% towards rapid rehousing, which is great. So again, just to give you an idea of where we are, and we've got, obviously, you see that 19.54 funds remaining to draw. Next slide, please. So again, just another way to kind of look at where we are. Of the 361 recipients, we've got 233 or over 80% drawn, which is great. Again, we're looking at that September 30th deadline, and I'll be going over the deadlines in a couple of slides. We're looking at that September 30th deadline. We're going to be doing some outreach, within the within the very near future, if it's looking like you may not meet that September 30th deadline. So, but we're doing, most of us are doing really well as far as where you are with your draws. As you can see, 233% are very close to being fully drawn. They're over 80% drawn. We've got another almost 100 that are 60 to 80%. We just have a couple of stragglers that are under 50%, and we'll be looking and reaching out to those folks as well in the next couple of weeks. Next slide, please. Again, I think, we touched on this a little bit already, but we do look at draw rates on a weekly basis. It was really important that to leadership here at HUD that this money get into communities and be spent to respond to the pandemic. So, anytime we do understand that draw rates are going to kind of, possibly ebb and flow. But anytime we see that they're starting to slow down, we'll usually start to ramp up our outreach just to remind folks about that quarterly, that compliance issue where you really should be drawing at least quarterly. They have been down over the last few months. I expect that they will be going up again because the deadline is nearing and because you all will start to receive some emails from your CARES Act desk officer about the fact that, you're projected not to meet the deadline. So what we're asking you to do now, or if you're sitting here thinking like you might be one of the 40% people drawn, what should we do? Take a look at your progress. And again, like we're projecting out, we're going to be sending some outreach emails out. So with projections based on your most recent draws, if you're projected out to meet the September 30th deadline. But you don't wait for that email. Look at your progress, look at what you've been doing. I think the first thing to do is to look and see, are we drawing quarterly? If you're not, at least get up to quarterly. But look at your expenditures and your QPR, talk to your subrecipients. If you're a recipient, check and make sure that, they're kind of on track to spend down, however much money they have left to spend by the September 30th, 2023 deadline. If you guys will probably remember, we published a notice last year updating some of the deadlines, obviously extending from last September to this September. And we also extended the deadline for two specific line items, for HMIS and for administration funds, because we recognize that you need those funds for closeout. So even though you have to stop spending on eligible costs on September 30th, there is still work to be done, and we recognize that. So we wanted you to be able to kind of pay yourselves to be able to do that work. So the HMIS and admin funds need to be expended by December 31st, 2023. So by the end of this calendar year. So again, project out, talk to your HMIS lead if you haven't talked to them, see what you'll need to do in order to be able to kind of wrap up that grant. And we will be talking about closeout in a couple of slides, so you will get an idea of what needs to happen in order for us to actually be able to officially close out your grant. If you have concerns about not meeting the deadline, please reach out now for TA. You don't have to wait for HUD to send you an email. And we have some resources on the last slide that you'll see when I'm done speaking of how to get TA. But many of you have probably already communicated in some way, shape, or form with your CARES Act desk officer here in SNAPS. So please reach out to them. They're here to help you answer any questions. If there's something that you're thinking of spending funds on, but maybe you haven't yet, and so you don't know if it's eligible, or please ask your desk officer or submit an AAQ, and we'll definitely work with you guys to make sure you get that money spent down. Next slide, please. So this. And I think I saw some questions in the chat about deadlines. And so this just kind of puts it all into a nice little table for you. So as I said, so all of the original ESG-CV CARES Act money that you received back in 2020, remember there were two rounds. There was a June, was it June? April and then June. I'm sorry, I can't remember, but it's all a blur. But you got two kind of pots of money. That's all considered like kind of one allocation for your initial CARES Act. So that deadline was extended from last September to this September 30th, 2023. You've got then time to make your final draw, which is April 30th, 2024. And this is all outlined in the notice from last spring as well. And then you have the deadline to finalize and get your final quarterly report or your final QPR in, which is July 31st, 2024. ESG-CV rounds 1 and 2, HMIS and admin, like I just discussed, you can take a little bit of extra time to spend that money down. So you can have expenditures and draw down those expenditures through December 31st, 2023. And then again, you see the draw deadline and the QPR deadline. So I think somebody in the chat asked about reallocated funds. If you were one of the communities who received reallocated funds, we did give you in the notice last year specified that you were going to get some extra time. We didn't want to penalize you for getting the extra money and then expect you to hurry up and spend it by September 30th this year. So for just those reallocated funds, you have until June 30th, 2024 to spend. Now, again, it's just for those reallocated funds. So if you, in the first two, your 2020 allocation rounds 1 and 2 were $1.5 million, that $1.5 million has to be spent on eligible cause by the end of September this year. If last year in the fall, you got an additional $500,000, that $500,000 has to be spent by June 30th, 2024. So just because you got reallocation dollars doesn't mean that your entire CARES Act amount is extended through June 30th. It's just that amount that you received during that reallocation in late 2022. So hopefully that all makes sense. Next slide. So now let's talk a little bit about the closeout process. So we are in the process of finalizing documents and guidance documents for you all. We have a closeout memo that's an internal document that outlines the process for us. So there are a couple of things. I will go in the next slide, I will go over more about what exactly has to be in place in order for you to be able to completely close out your whole entire ESG CARES Act grant. But I do want to make note because it may be a little bit confusing right now because you have seen and we've guidance and we have done a webinar, I think last fall, about closing out your project in Sage or closing out your reporting in Sage. So that is just a piece of the overall grant closeout process. So I don't want anybody to think, well, I did my thing in Sage, we spent our money, we closed out in Sage, so my grant is closed out. It is not yet closed out. That just simply means, quite frankly, that we know now that you are done spending the money. You will not be serving any more clients, and we are not going to bug you for the next several quarters and say, where's your QPR? Where's your QPR? Why haven't you submitted it? You're late. Because you're done. So there is something that you need to do in Sage if you are done serving people. We have not provided you with that overall grant closeout guidance yet, so you wouldn't know what to do. So you all have not missed anything or you're not behind if you're one of our handful of folks who stopped serving people a while ago. But we did want to get that. That's why we got that Sage guidance out to you, because we didn't want you to have to think that you had to keep saying HUD, no clients, in the QPR each quarter. So that guidance has been on Sage. It's been posted on Sage. It's also on the HUD Exchange. And it basically tells you how to submit your final QPR. There's also, I think there's a link, as I said, there was a CV reporting office hours in September of 2022, and it goes through that very specific, again, that QPR closeout process. So look for that if you have any questions. But again, I just want to make sure everybody understands if you've done that QPR closeout process, there will still be work for you to do or documentation for you to provide to make sure that your entire grant gets closed out. And we most likely will not be officially closing those grants out until the next calendar year. We'll do probably one batch of the closeout once everybody's ready to be closed out. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're talking about closing out your entire grant. So not just the QPR. QPRs can kind of get closed down whenever you stop spending money and stop serving clients, right? So when, but you still have to we still have to close out, work with you to close out your entire grant. So there are a couple of things that have to be in place, and this is kind of like legally, we can't close a grant out in the systems and basically say this grant is no longer active. We can't do that until there are several things in place. First, we need to make sure that you've expended and drawn down all your grant funds, or you returned any remaining funds. So basically, there has to be a zero balance on the grant. We hope that no money gets returned, but we know that that's really not realistic. We're probably going to have some folks that have to return money. We will work with you all to get that money recaptured. And then we will be able to say that there's a zero balance on the grant. And so that one requirement or that parameter has been met in order to be able to close out the grant. We need to make sure that all your eligible activities, all the activities that you spent money on were eligible and were completed. We need to make sure that you submitted the final QPR. So that goes back to the previous slide around, submit your final QPR, look at that guidance on how to, there are certain boxes that you need to check to let us know it's your final, and it has to be approved. So those of you that do QPRs know that there is a process and you submit them in Sage, HUD does review them. Oftentimes we kind of go back and forth because we might have a question. There might be a red flag or a validation error where we're seeing that there was money spent here, but no clients or something like that. So just submitting that final QPR is not quite enough. HUD needs to approve that. So we're not going to be able to close out a grant until HUD is approved. And so if there's some back and forth happening, we'll have to, resolve all of that before we can approve the QPR and then go ahead and close down the grant. We have to verify that you expended all the program income within that period of performance, whether it's the September 30th, 2024 deadline, the couple month extension for the HMIS and admin dollars, or if you've got that extension for your reallocated funds. So we just confirm that everything was spent within the appropriate timeframes. This is number 5 is another key thing. And this, quite frankly, sometimes leads to grants staying open and active, even when the reports are done, the money's been gone, we're not serving anybody anymore. Many of you on this call may have been audited or monitored by your field office or possibly some CARES Act staff here in HUD. Monitorings are a lot of work, and we understand that. And when we come at you with a letter that has findings in, and you have to work to resolve those findings, and the field office has to basically certify that yes, you've satisfied, whatever the finding was, and you've done the work to kind of close out that finding. Oftentimes, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of back and forth between the field office and the recipient to make sure that the finding is addressed properly. And so oftentimes this is the one thing that holds up closing out a grant. It's not the money, it's not the reporting, it's that you've got this monitoring letter sitting here and you're still working with the field office, or in our case, with CARES Act staff to make sure that all of your findings have been resolved. But we can't close a grant out until they're all resolved. So that's something that we'll also work with you on if we get to a point where you're ready to close out, but we're still, trying to resolve some monitoring findings with you. And then this last point is kind of, you'll see it in the guidance that we put out, and it's kind of almost a catch-all. No other responsibilities under the grant or other responsibilities under the grant have been carried out. So again, we're just looking to make sure you used the money how you were supposed to use it. It's either all gone or the amount that you're returning has been returned back or recaptured. Your reporting's done and you don't have any open audit or monitoring findings. Next slide, please. So this is talking again about the final QPR submission. So you want to go and look at that guidance and submit your final QPR when you can answer kind of yes to these 3 things. That funding for all of your projects have ended. So the clients will no longer be served with CARES Act funding. that you fully expended all your funding. You're not going to be incurring any more costs, because again, if you're incurring costs, then you're most likely serving clients, and we're going to need you to report that on your QPR. And you've fully drawn down for that project or that sub, you've fully drawn down all of your CV funding and IDIS, because again, the QPR is about expenditures, but we want to make sure that, you know, you're kind of caught up. So we're going to be looking at that for final QPR submission as well. Next slide, please. So that is all that I have. So we have a ton of time. I think the session is supposed to go to 3:15. So we have a lot of time. We may be able to give you some time back in your day, but I assume we probably have some questions in the chat. So I know that Sharon Singer she's the ESG-CV lead here in the SNAPS office, and she's been answering questions in the chat, so I want to acknowledge her. But I will go ahead and just see if there's any questions. I think Chris Pitcher, were you going to toss me some questions if we had some?
I think I will. Thanks for everyone for being here. And Karen, it's good to see you as well. I'm going to start off with a softball just to kind of get you going. This is a very easy one. What does the QPR stand for, just in case you've never heard that particular thing before?
Quarterly Performance Report.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to save some of the harder ones for the end, because there is one here that I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer. But Janelle and Alexandra both asked a similar question that you have answered, but I just want to bring it back up because the slide where you have those deadlines, it's a dead slide. And I just get confused. So for round 1 and round 2, and then if we go back to ESG-CV, it came out in 2 pieces. We kind of originally talked about round 1, 2. We don't really talk about it like that anymore. So we have we have ESG-CV that ends on 9/30, and any funds that you received from reallocation from anyone else ends on 6/30 of next year.
Right. Yeah.
Just want to go over that again. We have 2 questions.
And I mean, if you all are not sure, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. So please reach out to your desk officer or submit an AAQ if you have any questions about this. Because we just want to make sure that you're straight so that you don't miss out spending some funds or anything like that. So yeah, but that's essentially, Chris, the way you summarized it is absolutely correct.
Thank you for pulling these slides up. This is exactly what folks are asking questions about. Okay, let's go to a different one. This question came from some of our CDBG-CV friends, I believe. The QPR for CDBG-CV is in IDIS, but there is not one for ESG-CV. Where can that be found?
It's in SAGE. Our SAGE is specific to SNAPS. So the SAGE, it's the SAGE reporting repository. I think it's SAGE. Let me see what the email address is. I have it bookmarked, so I never, but it's like SAGE info. All right, I'll get you the SAGE. Yeah, I'll have to get the email or the, but if you look on the HUD Exchange, if you go to the reporting office hours or you go to the HUD Exchange and just Google SAGE, like you should be able to get to the SAGE website pretty easily, and you have to have an account and everything. So if you are new, I'm guessing maybe somebody's asking that question because maybe they're new to CARES Act, even though the community's had CARES Act for a while. I know there's always staff turnover. So if you are not sure where to find SAGE or how to get into SAGE, submit an AAQ. That's probably, if you don't know who your CARES Act desk officer is here at HUD, submit an AAQ and someone will reach out to you.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to get into some more difficult questions. Adam asks, I don't remember the distinction between expenditures and draws being made in the notices regarding progressive expenditure deadlines. Can you point to where this distinction was made?
I don't know the section of the notice off the top of my head, but we do, especially in the original ESG-CV notice, and then I believe in the subsequent updated notice, we do distinguish because we distinguished about or between the two because it was very important back in the days when we were looking at those progressive deadlines. We were looking at the notice actually said expenditures, which we did on purpose because we know that expenditures oftentimes are a little bit more up to date. Again, to my other point, A lot of people don't draw, but maybe once a quarter, and some people don't even do that. But they could show us in their QPR that their expenditures were over the 20%, let's say, or whatever deadline. So the expenditures was something that we looked at, and that we specifically stated in the notices, because we didn't want to ding people and possibly recapture money because they hadn't drawn in IDIS. Because again, expenditures are what your subrecipients are telling you is the recipient that they spent, right? You're, in many cases, you're paying them back, and that's all, that's all fine, and that's all happening at the local level, but you don't turn around and draw down to reimburse yourself as a recipient until maybe 3 months later. And so we wanted to be able to give people credit for the money that they were actually had spent on clients, and had, reimbursed their subs for, not just what they drew, because we know that draws and IDIS usually lag behind recipients or expenditures, sorry. Hopefully that made sense.
It did to me. All right, thank you for that. We are now getting questions coming in at a good clip, so we're just going to start going down the list here, Karen.
Okay.
Could we amend, and this is coming from Damon, could we amend the remaining ESG-CV contracts with our providers for an end date of up to September 30th this year?
So so the only thing that you can spend money on after September 30th, was he asking if they can amend them to September 30th?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I thought you were asking past September 30th. Yeah. At the local level, if you need to, and I assume many did this after the notice came out last year when we extended, because remember the original deadline for CV was September 30th, 2022. So a lot of people had to amend sub-agreements, or contracts with their subs because they had an extra year to spend money. So, that's that at the local level. If you guys need to do that to make sure that they continue to spend funds through the end of the now deadline, September 30th, 2023, that's fine.
If we could go back to the slide with the deadlines, we have one more deadline question. Just want to make sure we got this one all the way down. There it is. So please clarify. ESG-CV expenditure deadline being September 30th this year, drawdown deadline being April 30 of next year.
So again, we know that draws lag. When you draw down after the expenditure deadline, we expect that you are drawing down for funds that were spent on eligible activities prior to that expenditure deadline. So that doesn't mean, you just need to make sure that all costs are incurred. I think we like to say that phrase too a lot, that all costs are incurred by September 30th. You don't have to turn around on October 1 and draw everything down. We know it takes time, especially if this is kind of the end of the program or the project, if you will, with some of your subs. It's going to take time for them to, kind of reconcile everything and submit that maybe final invoice to you all. And so you have until September 30th, you have quite a bit of time to do all the draws that you need to do. But past that date, you won't be able to draw an IDIS. But so that's the distinction there. So if you think you have until September 30th, 2024 to spend the money, you don't. You have to make sure that you're spending it on eligible activities before September 30th of this year. But then you have some time to do all that final closing out reconciliations with your subs, getting those final invoices, things like that, reconciling all of them, making sure everything was eligible, what they're billing you for was eligible, doing all that work. You have until April 30th to get that all done and draw.
This is an interesting question. I love your reaction to it. Are any of these funds subject to clawback or being pulled back due to the debt ceiling not being raised if that were to happen?
So that's a very good question. If I had a crystal ball, it is really it's a possibility. I got to be honest. We have not been told officially in any way, shape, or form here at SNAPS that absolutely they are going to start clawing back money come June 1st or come June 2nd if there's no, if the debt ceiling isn't extended. So it is a possibility. It's tough to be in your shoes, because you guys want to make sure that you're good stewards of the money. You don't want to run out there between now and next Thursday and spend down all your money so it doesn't get clawed back, because that you don't want to be in that kind of situation. And that can sometimes lead to people spending maybe on things that probably weren't eligible, or, so I don't want anybody to panic, because we haven't been told that, like I said, officially, that anything's going to happen. But from what we're seeing, from what we're hearing, and obviously you guys watch the news, and that's where the question's coming from, there is a possibility that that could happen. So I would say, to best prepare for that, again, don't run out and, buy 10 outreach vans because, you think you need to spend all the money. But I would definitely, make sure that everything is kind of caught up and up to date. And if you need to draw down, please draw down. I mean, we do, like we said, we have a lot of folks who haven't drawn in many, many months. So spend some time over this next week to look at all of your financials. And if you haven't done a draw in a while, draw down, because we quite frankly just don't know for sure what's going to happen.
Okay. So Harvinder asks a question. The QPR is generally due about 30 days after the quarter. Do we have additional time to submit a final QPR to make sure that funds get drawn down correctly in IDIS?
Yeah. So if you see the deadlines here for like the end, if you go up until the end, I would say, even if you, let's say you stop spending money at the end of this month, at the end of May. And so you're not, you're done before the grant is officially kind of over, the full expenditure deadline, but you want to take some time. And so the QPR is going to be due, the next round of QPRs will be due. If you need some extra time to submit that QPR, I would say reach out to your ESG-CV desk officer here in SNAPS. They will, they can extend and kind of give you a little bit of an extension in order to get all of that kind of final reconciliation done. It's kind of understandable that you might need that. So we have been known to extend the QPR deadline for folks on a case-by-case basis when they just ask basically and tell us why they need an extension. Sometimes it's a technical issue, we can extend.
All right, question from Sam. Is this grant, referring to ESG-CV, available to new applicants that just found out about this program?
So I'm assuming you are not an ESG direct recipient, but you're hearing about ESG's, the CARES Act allocation in your community. It's going to depend on your community. My guess is there's probably not a lot of folks that are doing anything new with their CARES Act allocation, given that it's the end of May and funds need to be spent by the end of September. But it really all depends on your community. So I would say it doesn't hurt to ask. It doesn't hurt to ask your ESG recipient in your community. If you're not sure who that is, you can go online. The HUD Exchange or HUD.gov should be able to, you should be able to do a quick search and find out who receives the ESG allocation in your community and ask them if they, if they have any money. Sometimes, we know that, again, staff turnover, programs close. Sometimes they may have a need for somebody to step in even for a very short term and fill a need and spend down some dollars. I'm just not sure about your specific community, what their needs are, but I would definitely ask. Doesn't hurt.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, so from Pamela, excuse me, is there a projected date for the closeout guidance, or is the way to know what will be addressed and to begin getting ready for the closeout?
Good question. So Sharon, I'm going to ask you, because you're probably in more contact with the TA providers than I am. I know they've been working on it for some time now, so I think we're close. I don't want to say though, like, oh, it'll definitely be out next week, but I think it'll be out in the next couple of weeks. And it's essentially going to have things like checklists in there and everything, so that you can literally like read through, is this, is this done? Check. Is this done? Check. And so that it'll help you walk through to know, am I ready to tell HUD that we're ready to close out? But Sharon, do you have an ETA on that guidance?
Yeah, we will have it at the beginning of June, so very soon. And so there will be a webinar and a very straightforward checklist. And we will have that tied to all of the closeout procedures, but we will have a separate one later in June tied specifically to QPRs. And there, as I answered somebody, we already have some guidance out on QPR, submitting your final one if you're at that stage already. But stay tuned. So in the next couple of weeks, and we should be advertising the webinar soon.
Thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And Karen, this is the one I keep punting because I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer it, and I don't want to set you up for that. This comes from Jose. Is there an IDIS report I can use to verify that ESG-CV program activities generated program income? Or is there any other report around program income that we can use? There's an additional question about Hoplo CV that I'm going to just hold, Jose, but for ESG-CV, anything about where we can find information on program income within IDIS?
Yeah, I don't. So I'm thinking, well, if Chris doesn't know the answer, because I ask you IDIS questions, right? So, so you're right. I am not sure, Jose, but we can get you an answer if you want to throw your email address, even just like you can message like Chris or I privately if you don't want to put it all out there, and we can get an answer, because that is a very good question. I'm just not sure where to find that in IDIS if you can. I don't know.
I know it's in there somewhere. I will have to figure out how to find it. It is not in any of our standard ESG or ESG-CV reports, largely because the guidance from HUD has been around ESG. Do not make program income. Don't generate it. Don't store security deposits back. Don't do things that create program income. It is very difficult for the ESG program, as opposed to different HUD programs, to do that. So I know it has to exist, and yes, Jose, if you want to drop an email, and then we will find it, but that is not something that ESG or ESG-CV typically does. Okay, anonymous question here for you, Karen. Can leftover funding from ESG-CV be used to buy supplies for cold weather shelters for the next year?
So, I forgot to say this. I told Chris I was going to kind of start out and say that I don't want to give absolute guidance and say absolutely something is an eligible expense or not an eligible expense just on this national webinar without knowing the specifics to your question. On the face of it, it sounds like that, you're purchasing it, it's not that you're waiting to purchase in January, you're purchasing it. There is some language around certain eligible costs about being used to respond to coronavirus and COVID and during the pandemic and things like that. So I don't want to say that absolutely you could do that. What I'd like for you to do is submit that question to the AAQ. We meet twice a week and actually go over all the questions that are submitted in the AAQ with the help of TA providers. They go over a lot of them and triage them for us, and then we meet and discuss them as well as a team in snaps. So we can take a look and be as specific as you can be in the question. That you have outreach dollars and you want to use those dollars to buy X number of whatever for next year's shelter. It may be something that's allowable, but I just don't want to say yes it is and then find out that exactly what you wanted to do actually wasn't allowable. So anybody that has any questions about eligible expenses, please don't hesitate to ask the question in the AAQ, because we'll get back to you, because we want to help you spend that money as much as we can.
Thank you, Karen. From Robin, so we should wait to do our final QPR until all funds have been drawn down, even if that's in early 2024.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm not sure who this came from, but regarding number 5, so I think this was on a different slide. I'm not sure which slide that was. When it's time to close out, what if we initiate closeout and no monitoring has happened? Is there a possibility that monitoring could happen after closeout?
Ooh,
number 5.
That's a good question. So obviously we can't hold you responsible for monitoring that hasn't happened. And this is kind of like a federal rule, and I want to say I think it's a number of years, and I can't remember off the top of my head, and you will see this in the closeout guidance, that The federal government, basically, it's not just HUD, but HUD has the right to come in after a grant is closed. Because this is around record keeping, right? We don't want you, like, the minute everything's closed, to like rip everything up and throw it in the trash, which I know everything's electronic now anyways, but you can't just destroy all your files like, whew, this is over. I'm glad it's over. We're never getting this money again. We're throwing everything away. You have to keep your records for a certain, I think it's like 7 or 8 years. So monitoring could happen afterwards. We're not going to keep grants open just in case, everybody, would get monitored. Now, depending on where we are, we'll be working with the field office. And so we'll be asking the field office, okay, we've got this grant that's ready to close out. Were they monitored? We didn't monitor them. Did you monitor them? Generally, we know, but just in case, we'll ask if they monitored them. We'll ask if the monitoring has been closed. If there's, something, I mean, you all probably know they're on a pretty religious cycle of how they monitor each year. So come September, all of their monitoring is going to be done for the most part. They don't usually go out in like November and start to monitor. So if you haven't been monitored, again, we kind of reserve the right as the federal government to come in afterwards and inspect your records, but it's not necessarily going to, if you haven't been monitored and obviously there's no open findings or open audits, we're not going to hold your grant open, like, just in case, because we have the right to come back in. It's pretty rare that happens, I have to be honest, but it's the federal language around it. So if you haven't been selected for monitoring, chances are we'll just go ahead and close your grant out when all the other requirements are met.
Adelina asked an additional question about monitoring that I believe you already answered, but being notified about monitoring, that could happen all the way up through the end of the grant term, which for ESG-CV now for reallocated funds goes through basically the beginning of July 2024.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, like I said, the field office has been doing a lot of the monitoring. They do a risk assessment every year at the beginning of the calendar year, and then that helps them plan who's going to be monitored during the spring and the summer. And so, generally they will start to send out notifications that they're, that your grant was selected to be monitored, late winter, in the spring, maybe early summer, and they try to get that on the books because they want to have all their active monitoring where they're out there meeting with people, reviewing case files, things like that. That needs to all be wrapped up by September 30th. That doesn't mean everything's going to be resolved, but they need to wrap up whoever they monitored during that federal fiscal year. They need to kind of wrap their portion of the monitoring up and at least get a monitoring letter out before the end of the federal fiscal year. So while, like, technically you could be told at any time that you're going to be monitored, the field office does follow a pretty kind of strict, like I said, cycle of notification. It would be rare. I'm not going to say it'll never happen, but it would be rare to get notification from HUD in December that, hey, we're coming in January to monitor you, because that's not really the cycle that they're on. But again, things happen, you never know, but that's why we want you to, keep all of your documentation, keep all of your files, because, it could happen.
Ebony also asked, still on the monitoring, how will reporting work for agencies that use CV funds for shelter renovations? Will this likely fall under monitoring?
So let me see if I understand. So that's a good question. So there are some like certain parameters around shelter renovations and kind of the requirements past even the deadline of the grant and things like that. So if you're asking, you're not going to automatically be monitored if you use some of the CARES Act funds for renovations. That's not like an automatic trigger that you'll be monitored. There is guidance in the notices, and we'll put some guidance out around closeout, probably around what is expected of you as far as like any sort of like restricted covenant or anything, if you use the funds for hard costs, which we know that some folks did. And I think we were able to, kind of establish some slightly different parameters around CARES Act funds than the rest of our kind of SNAPS funds. So I'm not sure if that answers your question about monitoring and like using the funds to purchase a shelter, purchase property, hard costs, things like that. If it doesn't, just put it back in the chat or submit it to the AAQ.
And yeah, and Sharon answered a question about disposition as well, inside the disposition instructions, so folks should have seen that.
Mm.
Couple of creative conversations for folks. It looks like they're trying to spend the money before the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
Just if you can answer these, I'll put them in a place that you might be able to. So if we have a lot of additional funds left in our administrative budget, and we're actually trying to amend our ESG-CV contracts, would we follow the citizen participation plan to make these amendments and submit a revised plan to HUD? Are there any creative suggestions to make sure we expend these funds?
So that's a good question. That's what I'm thinking about, the citizen participation plan, because we waived all of that right early on when everybody was getting these, when people were getting these funds. So I don't believe that you have to go through that process, but definitely that's a local decision. But I don't believe that that HUD, as far as HUD's concerned, that you would have to go through the citizen participation process, because again, it's still CARES Act funds, and that was waived. As far as creative, to try to spend down the money. The one thing that I tell people that seems kind of common sense, but I think a lot of people kind of forget, because we've been through a lot since April, really January of 2020. And I'm looking up here on my board so the pandemic started on, the federal declaration was January 21st, 2020. CARES Act, the CARES Act and our ESG notice gives you kind of permission to go all the way back to that federal declaration date of January 21st, 2020. It's kind of unusual with our money. Usually we're looking forward and what can you spend the money on moving forward. But in this case, it might be worth talking to some folks locally, like in your program, because obviously CARES Act wasn't passed until April. So there were months that a lot of you all were dealing with COVID before we even really knew what it was, right? But you were dealing with it in your communities, you were paying overtime, you were purchasing supplies, you were buying, maybe test kits or, masks and gloves and things like that. And you just, people haven't even thought that all that money that you spent in January, from January 21st, in February, in March, in April, in May, that you can reimburse yourself for those funds. Again, going back to the January 21st deadline. So, I always tell people to take a look at that and make sure that they've kind of done that. They've gone back and they've looked to make sure that they've kind of made themselves whole for any money that they've spent going all the way back to the January deadline. I mean, as far as anything else creative, I mean, it's so hard because there's so many different things that you can spend your money on. Marlise is like the queen at whipping stuff out. And of course she's not on the call, but I can't think of anything else. But again, if nothing's we've heard it all and we've seen it all. And if you have a question about spending your money, please put it in the AAQ, because there's a chance. I mean, when we have these meetings and we look at people's questions, we are trying really hard to say yes. We want you to be able to spend down the money, but we don't want you to get in trouble. So we will try any way, shape, or form to get to a yes. If you, send us a question and say we haven't spent our money on this yet, but we want to see if we can, spend it on this. So, but I think a lot of people, if you go back to that January 2020 deadline, I think that, a lot of people may find eligible costs that they can reimburse themselves for, that will help them spend down.
Thanks, Karen. Another creative question from Anonymous. Can rapid rehousing funds be transferred to emergency shelter funds under ESG-CV, since those funds can be spent more quickly, since we're getting closer to the deadline?
I believe they can. I don't think there's a prohibition. Sharon, do you recall? I'm trying to think if we've had this question.
Well, if they've committed the funds, they would need to move the funds in IDIS,
right,
to that new area. And then the question is, does that mean you're changing the subrecipient who's getting those funds? So you just have to make sure that you take all the required steps.
Yeah. So again, as far as HUD's concerned, and that's the kind of creative thinking that is good, especially now, as we're trying to wind down these grants. if you are looking, for ways to shift it around, and you're a subrecipient, definitely talk to your recipient. I mean, as far as HUD is concerned, we just want you to spend the money on eligible costs, so you don't get in trouble, at the end of the day. But definitely talk to your recipient and see, if there's a way to do that. And like Sharon said, you just need to make sure it's all documented properly in IDIS.
I think this is a common question we hear as well, Karen, because we did have such a push and focus on two things when we first started the pandemic. It was non-congregate shelter, which folks are hopefully winding down. And we really want to focus on wrap-free housing as the only permanent housing intervention. So I think folks are getting to the point where we got to make a decision. Either we spend the fund on something else, or we don't spend the funds. So
Yep.
All right. From Santiago, and I'm not sure if you know this answer either. Since September 30th of this year is the last day that ESG funds can be expended, does this mean that the LOCKSS date has to be before that day? And I think this is kind of a how LOCKSS works with IDIS. It might not be something we can answer today here.
Yeah. Oh, but you know what? I mean, I would definitely submit that to the AAQ because I would want to noodle through that. But I believe, I got to know very intimately the difference between like the LOCKSS dates and when things are submitted in IDIS and everything, when we were looking at the deadlines and how to, and like who potentially to recapture from to see if people met deadlines. So I think what Santiago might be referring to is if the deadline is September 30th and you go ahead and, do a draw and it shows that the draw was done, you do a draw on September 29th, but your second person doesn't go in and actually approve that draw until October 1st. Is that okay? And that should be okay. But I'm not 100% sure that that's what you're asking. And I'm definitely not the LOCKSS expert, but there is some kind of nuances in there around when the draw shows up as like initiated in IDIS, and then when both people approve it, and then when it's in LOCKSS, and because then that's where you eventually get the money. So I probably just like confused everybody on the call, but definitely submit that question and we'll get you like a better answer than what I'm giving you. But I believe that the LOCKSS number doesn't have to match up perfectly, or that LOCKSS date doesn't have to match up perfectly.
Santiago said yes, you answered the question.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So I have no more open questions, Karen. I think what I am seeing is a question that I need more context on. So I'm just going to pause a little bit. I think one of the things that we've seen from the communities that have been monitored is there's some pretty common findings across the country in ESG-CV. So for those folks that are asking the monitoring questions, I think what I have seen is documentation and eligibility being really, really key, and folks struggling in that area a little bit because we were in the middle of a pandemic doing a lot of this work and trying to figure it out. So just any thoughts or any guidance you have, what people could expect around monitoring?
Yeah, and that's a good point, Chris. And I will say that was one of our biggest findings before the pandemic. So it's historically documentation and eligibility. It's historically been a challenge, we know, especially with the population that you all are serving. And so, doing what you do in the middle of a pandemic just compounded the challenges in many cases. And so, what I would suggest is, we definitely, when HUD come to monitor you and we're looking at things like that, documentation, that really shouldn't be the first time that you as a recipient are looking at your subs documentation, or that subrecipients that you're looking at that through case files or spot checking and making sure that documentation is there. If not, trying to follow up and get the documentation where it isn't there. So, as far as, Chris is absolutely right. That's usually one of our biggest findings, one of our most frequent findings. And generally, I think hopefully now that things have kind of calmed down a little bit, it's not May of 2020 right now. We're not in the midst of kind of the public health crisis and really just the scariness that it was. Hopefully now you guys can find a little bit of time to internally review your case files if you're a subrecipient, or if you're a recipient, go to your subs and again, spot check some case files and make sure they have their documentation there. Because again, the last thing that HUD wants to do when they come to monitor, we really don't want to take money back. And again, just as I said before, like we will try to get to a yes if there's any way possible. We will try to work with you to make sure that you don't have to repay money if you are missing documentation. So if you get a head start and you see that maybe for a period of time at the very beginning, people weren't asking for a certain piece of paper or for a certain thing, but you've remedied that, then that's the kind of thing that we want to hear about when we come out to monitor, because that's really what the finding is going to be about. Not just, oh, this is wrong, give us money back. It's going to be, this is wrong, but here's what you can do to resolve it. And a lot of times it's just moving forward, make sure this is in place, and it helps to avoid recapture in a lot of instances. But yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing I'm hearing from folks around the CARES Act monitoring is the documentation. And it's a beast. I mean, we all, most of us on the call, I think, have been in communities and we know we've done it. We know how hard it is. So it's a lot of work to get all that.
Travis asks, is there a limit on how much an agency can use ESG-CV funds for renovation or expansion of emergency shelter?
I would have to double check the notice. I don't think we had a cap on that. Do you remember? I don't think we did. That's not. Yeah, we tried to be as kind of like permissive as possible, I guess, with the CARES Act allocation.
So we have talked about reallocated funds a few times, and I think it's confused some folks. So someone just asked, when will reallocated funds be released? Those were completed last fall. You want to talk about that reallocation process a little bit? Oh,
sure. Yeah. So I think we talked earlier in this session today about, and you guys kind of lived through the craziness that was the progressive deadlines, right? So we had the 20% and the 50% progressive deadline back in 2021 and 2022. Was it? It's all a blur to me now, but basically we looked at your expenditures to see if you had met the deadlines. If you did not meet the deadline, we actually gave, especially for the 20% deadline, we actually asked folks to submit spending plans, and we had literal like one-on-one case conferences as a team to look at the spending plan to see if we thought that the recipient would be able to meet the 20% deadline if they hadn't already met it based on what they were telling us. So there were a handful of folks who just either didn't submit spend plans, or even the spend plan just left us wondering, would they really meet that 20%? Are they close to meeting that 20% deadline? And so for those folks, we did have to recapture some funds. So those funds were recaptured. We had a 20% and a 50% deadline. We did one recapture. We did not recapture twice. I think that recapture happened last June, if I'm remembering correctly, June of 2022, maybe July. But the recapture happened in the summer. And then what we did, we worked with there's another office outside of SNAPS in HUD, Policy Development and Research. They're like all of the statistical like genius minds, and they worked with us to develop a formula so that we could reallocate the money. What we wanted to do was get the money that was recaptured. We wanted to try, if at all possible, to keep it local as possible. So for instance, if money was recaptured, I'm just going to pick on, I live in Columbia, Maryland. If money was recaptured from Columbia, Maryland, we didn't want it to go necessarily to Spokane, Washington. Not that Spokane maybe didn't need the money, but we wanted to try to keep it as local as possible. So we had a formula that was created where we kind of tried to go up. So if my town couldn't use some of the money, and it got recaptured, or we didn't meet the deadline and it got recaptured, could it go to the county, or could it go to the city, or could it go to the state? So we ran this formula, and I think all but maybe one reallocation or one recapture stayed local, went somewhere else in the state, which was great. That was what we wanted to do. So we ran this formula. Then we sent letters out because we basically had to tell, I think it was like 67 recipients, like you have the option to take this extra money, basically. And at that point, the notice had come out already. I think it was last April that the updated notice came out. We extended the deadline from September 30th, 2022 to September 30th, 2023. And we also added that if you received reallocated funds, you would have until June 2024 to spend those, because we didn't want people to, again, to panic and think, I would love the extra money, but I don't think I can spend it by September 30th. So we sent letters to folks now these are ESG recipients. So if you're a subrecipient thinking, well, I never knew this, did we get money? I don't know, we sent letters to ESG recipients, because that's who we, have our grant agreements with, let them know that they were eligible to receive X number of dollars as part of the reallocation process. And we asked them to basically send back a form saying, yep, we want the money. Nobody declined it. Everybody took the money. So that money, then we have to go through apportionment and, financial stuff here, but that money kind of went through its process internally, and we updated grant agreements and we sent those to the field to get those processed. I want to say last end of the summer or maybe in the fall, because it all had to be obligated by September 30th of 2022. So that was based on what the language that was in the CARES Act. So all recipients that received reallocated funds, they all accepted their money, and they all have known for a while that they were getting this money. We have, I think, maybe a handful who are still working with making sure, getting the finalized grant agreements over to Fort Worth and that's our accounting office, sorry, and making sure that those agreements are in place and that the money's available so that they can commit it in IDIS. But I think we might be down to 1 or 2 recipients that are still kind of going through that process. So if you are a subrecipient and you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I didn't even know that this happened, and maybe there is extra money in my community, I would definitely say go to the HUD Exchange or HUD.gov. If you just search ESG-CV reallocation, you'll see the press release, you'll see the note, you'll see our, I think we have a list of, the communities that got money. You can see if your recipient is on there, and, just reach out. I know we did not prescribe to them what they needed to do with that reallocation. So we didn't say, well, you have to compete it out, or you have to run a formula to give that money out to subs in your area. They had local discretion on who was going to get that money and how they were going to get that money. So if you, at this point, HUD does not have, we're not any of the money that comes back to us is going to go to Treasury at this point. We're not going to recapture anything until it gets closer. Like I said, we'll do one recapture, and it'll probably not be until 2024, maybe early 2024, but you all will still be working on your QPRs and all of that stuff. So we don't have any more money to give out for CARES Act. That's all been done. As Chris said, it was done late last year. So if you're a sub and you're hearing this and you're wondering, I would say definitely just do a little bit of searching on the HUD Exchange or HUD.gov and see if your community did get some reallocated funds, and then see, if there's any left in your community.
And since we're on this topic, and Sharon answered this question in writing, but I think it's one that I think some communities have fear about. What happens at September 30? I haven't spent all the funds.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a negative consequence for me? Will they looked at differently? This was a big difference from annual ESG. Some communities got 14, 15, 16 times what they normally got.
Right.
So it's understandable that might be difficult, and there might be a little anxiety about, I can't actually get there. So what is your philosophy around that? I know there'll be explicit instructions in closeout, but just kind of folks' nerves maybe.
No, and I appreciate that, Chris, because it can be very it does cause some anxiety, and I don't want people to lose sleep over this. And, do your best. And again, I would rather see you have money recaptured, knowing that what you spent was on all your eligible activities, and it's all good. Don't rush around and just spend willy-nilly and then find out that you have to repay money because you bought something that you shouldn't have, because you were in a rush or a panic to spend down your funds. I can't emphasize that enough. As far as, is this a kind of a ding on you as an ESG recipient or anything like that? And, and I think we've tried to kind of, parlay some of these fears a little bit throughout this whole process. And we were asked this a lot, quite frankly, back when we were looking at the progressive deadlines. And, what does this mean for my ESG allocation? Does this mean that HUD might look and say, oh, well, they gave CARES Act money back, so we're going to cut their ESG allocation. We can't do that. It's a formula. So, it would literally take a new notice and practically an act of Congress for us to be able, and we don't want to do that. I've never, there's not that sentiment at HUD that we would ding you because you had to return some CARES Act money, that we would ding you on your annual ESG allocation. Again, it's much smaller. We know it's greatly needed in your communities, and we never would want to ding you based on the fact that, again, you got 15 times the amount of money and, oh, you had to return some. Again, it happens. We want to work with you, and we're going to push you to try to, get you to not return money. But I also don't want people thinking that, oh, HUD's going to take away all my money if we have to return CARES Act funds, because it's not something that we want to do to you all at all.
Yes, absolutely. That concludes our questions. There are a few questions I asked for some context, and we haven't received that context. So then we can wrap up. I think if folks have additional questions, please use the HUD Ask a Question to submit those for us. That's right here on the page. But Karen, if you have a wrap up, I say go for it. And thanks.
Okay.
Those great questions and answers.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you guys. Thanks everybody for being on. I think I looked at the very beginning, there's like 200 and some people, and I just looked down, I was like, wow, we have 438 people. So I'm glad so many of you guys were able to tune in. I hope it was helpful. As Chris said, please, any questions, submit them to the AAQ. If you did ask a question and we didn't go over it, since we had tons of time for questions, chances are we need some more context, as Chris said. So please submit your question to the AAQ and we'll try to get you an answer as soon as we can. To wrap up, I just want to say, we so greatly appreciate the work that you guys do every day. I had just uber respect for everybody that works in a community before the pandemic, and it's just grown exponentially since we've lived through coronavirus together, and you guys have tried to serve our clients during a pandemic, again with your own staffing issues and staff turnover and things like that, and getting, like Chris said, maybe 15 times the amount of money that you're used to getting for ESG. And we know people didn't staff up. You didn't have an opportunity to staff up, and we recognize that at HUD. So I just want to tell everybody that we definitely appreciate the work that you've done for the past 3 years with these funds. We appreciate that the work that you all do with our clients every day, and we will continue to appreciate the work even once this money's gone. We will continue to appreciate the hard work that you guys do. So I just want to thank you all. And again, if you have any questions that I wasn't able to answer, please submit them to the AAQ. And thanks to Chris, thanks Sharon, and thanks to all the ICF folks that made this webinar possible. So everybody have a good afternoon.